The town of Blackwood was the kind of place you'd see on postcards, a quaint little village surrounded by a sprawling forest of evergreens and oak trees. The forest was its crown jewel, drawing tourists year-round with promises of serenity, fresh air, and picturesque hiking trails. For Chris and his friends, it sounded like the perfect weekend escape. Chris had been planning the trip for weeks. He'd roped in his best friends, Emily, Jake, Lisa, and Mark. They were all city dwellers desperate for a break from the concrete jungle. The idea of camping under the stars and unplugging from their devices for a few days was a dream come true. The group packed their gear into Mark's rusty van early Saturday morning. Spirits were high, and the air buzzed with excitement as they left the city behind. The drive to Blackwood took about 4 hours, winding through country roads flanked by dense woods. Emily, the group's self-proclaimed nature lover, couldn't stop gushing about how stunning everything looked. "This place is perfect," she said, pressing her face against the window. "I can already smell the fresh air." Lisa smirked. "Let's hope the forest lives up to the hype. I didn't sign up to sleep in a bug-infested nightmare." "Relax," Jake said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "If it gets too rough, I'll build you a bug-proof fortress." As they entered Blackwood, the town greeted them with its charming simplicity. Wooden houses with steep roofs and neatly trimmed yards lined the narrow streets. A small diner with a flickering neon sign promised the best pie in the state, while a general store stood proudly at the town center. But something about the place felt off. The residents, though polite, seemed wary. They watched the group with an intensity that Chris couldn't quite explain. One old man sitting on the porch of the diner gave them a long, hard look as they passed. "Friendly folks," Mark muttered under his breath. Chris brushed it off. "Small towns are always like this. They probably don't get a lot of outsiders." Still, an unease crept into the van as they parked near the forest's main entrance. A large wooden sign welcomed them, "Blackwood Forest, nature at its purest." Before they could step onto the trail, a grizzled man with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes appeared. He was wearing a ranger's uniform but lacked the friendliness one might expect. "Planning to hike in there?" he asked, his voice gruff. Chris nodded. "Yeah, we're camping for the weekend. Any recommendations?" The man's eyes darkened. "Recommendation? Don't go too far in. Folks go missing in those woods." Jake laughed nervously. "Missing? Like what, bears?" The ranger didn't smile. "Something worse." Silence hung heavy between them as the group exchanged uneasy glances. Chris broke it. "We'll be careful." The ranger didn't reply, just tipped his hat and walked away. "Well, that was creepy," Lisa muttered. "Come on," Emily said, trying to lighten the mood. "It's probably just a story to scare tourists." But as the group ventured into the forest, the ranger's words lingered like a shadow, hinting at the terror that awaited them. The trailhead leading into Blackwood Forest was a picturesque start, lined with towering evergreens that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting soft golden patches on the forest floor. A crisp breeze carried the earthy scent of moss and pine, making the city's grime feel like a distant memory. Despite the ranger's warning, the group was in high spirits. Chris led the way, his backpack loaded with supplies, while Emily trailed close behind with a camera, snapping pictures of everything from the intricate bark patterns on the trees to a squirrel that darted across their path. "I swear, this could be straight out of a movie," she said, holding the camera up to frame the trail ahead. Lisa rolled her eyes. "Yeah, a horror movie. Creepy forest, weird locals, and that ranger. Come on." Jake laughed. "You watch too many scary movies. It's a forest, not a death trap." Mark, ever the joker, picked up a broken branch from the ground and swung it like a sword. "Don't worry, I'll protect you all from the big, bad monsters." Chris grinned but couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in since their encounter with the ranger. Something about the man's warning and the wary looks from the townsfolk didn't sit right with him. Still, he kept his doubts to himself. No need to ruin the mood. The trail they followed gradually narrowed, leading them deeper into the forest. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. The lively chirps of birds faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. They reached a small clearing just before sunset, a perfect spot to set up camp. The ground was flat, and the trees formed a natural barrier against the wind. "Home sweet home," Jake announced, tossing his bag to the ground. The group split into tasks, setting up tents, gathering firewood, and unpacking supplies. As they worked, Emily wandered off to take more photos. She wasn't far from the group, but something about the forest seemed to change the moment she was alone. The trees loomed larger, their twisted branches forming strange shapes. Shadows danced in unnatural ways, and the faint hum of insects grew louder, almost like whispers. Emily froze when her camera caught something unusual, a flash of movement in the distance. She lowered the lens and squinted into the trees. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and motionless, half hidden behind a tree. "Chris?" she called out, her voice shaky. No response. "Mark? Jake?" Still nothing. The figure didn't move. Before she could panic, Jake's voice called from the camp. "Emily, you good? Get back here, we're starting the fire." When she looked back toward the tree, the figure was gone. Emily hurried back, her heart racing. She told herself it was probably just a trick of the light or her imagination running wild. She didn't mention it to the others, no need to be the paranoid one in the group. By the time the fire was crackling and the first stars appeared, the earlier unease seemed to dissipate. They laughed, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories under the vast, starry sky. But somewhere deeper in the forest, a chainsaw roared to life, its sound faint, almost drowned out by the crackle of the fire and the group's laughter. The next morning, the forest seemed less threatening. Sunlight streamed through the trees, casting a warm glow over the campsite. Birds chirped overhead, and the earthy scent of dew on pine needles filled the air. The group was ready to explore deeper into Blackwood Forest. "All right, team," Chris said, adjusting his backpack. "We've got a full day ahead. Let's hit the trails." Lisa groaned as she tied her boots. "Do we have to? I thought camping was about relaxing, not hiking until your legs fall off." "Come on, Lisa," Emily teased. "You can post a selfie from the top of the mountain and brag about how outdoorsy you are." The group laughed, and even Lisa managed a grin. Spirits were high as they packed up their gear, leaving behind their tents and most supplies. They planned to return to the campsite by sundown. The trail started easy, well-marked and surrounded by dense greenery. Emily couldn't stop taking photos, occasionally pausing to admire the light filtering through the trees or a particularly gnarled branch. "This place is incredible," she said, snapping a picture of a moss-covered rock. "I don't get how people could ever disappear here." "Maybe they just didn't want to be found," Mark joked. Chris chuckled but felt a knot of unease in his stomach. Something about Emily's comment struck a nerve. As they hiked deeper into the forest, the trail became less defined. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwined overhead, blocking out the sun. The air felt heavier, cooler, and strangely silent. Are we still on the right path?" Jake asked, glancing around. Chris pulled out the map and frowned. The trail on the map seemed straightforward, but the forest around them felt different. The landmarks didn't match up. "We're fine," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "We just need to keep going. It's probably not as well maintained out here." They continued on, but unease began to creep into the group. The forest seemed alive, watching them. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made someone turn their head. Then they stumbled across something that stopped them cold. It was an abandoned campsite. The tents were shredded, as if by some enormous claw. A rusted lantern lay on its side, its glass cracked. Scattered around the site were personal belongings, a torn backpack, a boot, a moldy journal. "What the hell happened here?" Emily whispered. Jake picked up the journal, flipping through its damp, smudged pages. Most of the writing was illegible, but a single phrase stood out, scrawled across one page in shaky letters. "He's coming." Lisa backed away. "Nope. Nope, nope, nope. This is some Blair Witch stuff. We need to turn around right now." "Calm down," Chris said, though his own nerves were fraying. This could have been an animal. A bear, maybe. Mark pointed to the ground. "Yeah, because bears leave boot prints." The group looked down. In the dirt were large, heavy footprints. They weren't fresh, but they were unmistakably human, and they led deeper into the forest. A low, distant hum filled the air. At first, they thought it was the wind, but then it grew louder, more mechanical. "That sounds like a chainsaw," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No way," Lisa said, shaking her head. "It's probably just a woodcutter or something. People live around here, right?" But deep down, none of them believed it. "Let's keep moving," Chris said firmly, trying to mask his fear. "We'll head back to the campsite. We'll be fine." Reluctantly, the group pressed on, their once light-hearted chatter replaced by tense silence. The chainsaw sound faded, but the oppressive feeling in the air remained. Unbeknownst to them, something, or someone, was watching. Waiting. The group's pace quickened as they made their way back toward the campsite. The light-hearted atmosphere that had accompanied them that morning was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating something. Emily clutched her camera tightly, her eyes darting to every shadow. Lisa, walking close behind her, muttered under her breath, "I swear, if this is some elaborate prank, I'm going to kill whoever planned it." "No one planned anything," Chris said, though his voice lacked conviction. The trail grew even narrower, forcing them to walk single file. Gnarled roots jutted out from the ground, making it harder to move quickly. Every now and then, one of them would stumble, mutter a curse, and glance nervously behind. Then they came upon it. At first, it looked like just another fallen tree, its bark weathered and gray. But as they drew closer, they saw it wasn't just a tree, it was a chainsaw, embedded deep into the trunk. The rusted blade protruded at an odd angle, its teeth jagged and smeared with something dark that could have been oil, or dried blood. The group froze. "What the hell?" Jake said, stepping closer to inspect it. "Don't touch it," Chris warned. Jake hesitated, then backed away. Who leaves a chainsaw like that? And how does it even get stuck in a tree like this? Mark pointed to the ground. That's not the weirdest part. Around the base of the tree were more footprints, similar to the ones they'd seen at the abandoned campsite. These, however, were fresher. Lisa stared at them, her face pale. Someone was just here. The low hum of a chainsaw filled the air again, faint but unmistakable. This time, it was closer. Emily turned toward Chris, her voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." Chris nodded, his resolve finally cracking. "Back to the campsite. We'll grab our stuff and head for the car. No arguments." They turned and began walking briskly back the way they came, their footsteps crunching loudly on the forest floor. The sound of the chainsaw faded, but none of them felt any relief. As they moved, the forest seemed to grow darker, the trees closing in on them. The trail looked unfamiliar now, as if it had shifted in their absence. "This isn't the way we came," Emily said, panic rising in her voice. "It has to be," Chris replied, though doubt crept into his tone. "No," she insisted, her breathing quickening. "The trees weren't like this before. Something's wrong." A loud crack echoed through the woods. Everyone froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. "Just a branch," Mark whispered, trying to reassure himself. But when the noise came again, louder this time, it was followed by the unmistakable crunch of heavy footsteps. "Run," Chris said, his voice barely above a whisper. No one questioned him. They sprinted through the forest, their hearts pounding and lungs burning. The sound of the footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the revving of a chainsaw. Emily tripped over a root and fell hard, her camera skidding across the ground. Jake stopped to help her up, but when they looked back, they saw nothing. The chainsaw had stopped. The group regrouped, their breaths ragged and eyes wide with fear. "Did we lose it?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, a deep, guttural laugh echoed through the trees, sending chills down their spines. "Keep moving," Chris said, his voice breaking. "We have to keep moving." But no matter how far or fast they ran, the feeling of being watched never left them. The laughter echoed through the forest, growing louder and more menacing with each step they took. It didn't sound human, it was guttural, distorted, like something dragged up from the depths of hell. "Who the hell is that?" Lisa screamed, her voice breaking. Chris didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind raced as he tried to figure out how far they were from the campsite, or if they were even heading in the right direction. The forest seemed endless now, every tree blending into the next. Mark, usually the joker of the group, had gone silent. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his hands clenched into fists. "We're not alone," he muttered. "No kidding," Jake snapped. "But where is he? I don't see anyone." "Maybe that's the point," Emily said, clutching her camera as if it could protect her. The group slowed to a stop, panting and desperate to regain their bearings. Chris pulled out the map again, but it was useless. Nothing matched the terrain around them anymore. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, turning the map over and back again. "We should have been back at the campsite by now. What if we're going in circles?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. Emily turned her camera toward the trees, snapping photos rapidly. "I'm documenting this," she said, her voice shaking. "If we don't make it out, someone needs to know what happened." "That's not helping," Chris snapped, his nerves fraying. Suddenly, the forest fell silent. Not just quiet, the oppressive kind of silence that makes your ears ring. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just an unnatural stillness that froze the group in place. "Why did it get so quiet?" Mark whispered. Before anyone could answer, a faint metallic sound echoed through the trees. It was slow and deliberate, like a blade being dragged against something solid. The sound sent a wave of panic through the group. They bolted, running blindly through the forest, their survival instincts kicking in. "Stay together!" Chris shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the trees. The trail beneath their feet vanished, replaced by uneven ground littered with roots and rocks. Emily tripped again, this time falling hard and twisting her ankle. "Help me," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Jake skidded to a stop and hoisted her up, slinging her arm over his shoulder. The rest of the group hesitated, torn between staying together and running for their lives. Then they saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, just at the edge of their vision. Tall and broad-shouldered, it wore a torn flannel shirt and heavy boots. In its hands was a chainsaw, its blade rusted and splattered with something dark. The figure didn't move toward them. It simply stood there, watching. "Go!" Chris yelled, grabbing Emily's other arm to help her move faster. The group ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like they would give out. They burst into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive tree with blackened bark and twisted branches. "This isn't right," Lisa gasped, clutching her side. "We've been here before." Chris shook his head. "No, we haven't." "I don't." A loud roar interrupted him. The chainsaw revved to life again, closer this time. "Hide!" Mark hissed, pointing to a cluster of thick bushes. They dove into the underbrush, their breaths shallow and hearts pounding. The sound of footsteps grew louder, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. The figure stepped into the clearing, the chainsaw growling like a beast. It tilted its head as if sniffing the air, then let out another low, guttural laugh. The group held their breath, praying they wouldn't be found. But as the figure began to walk in their direction, Chris realized they wouldn't be able to hide forever. The figure stepped closer to the bushes where the group hid, the roar of the chainsaw deafening as it cut through the heavy silence. The smell of gasoline filled the air, mixing with the earthy scent of the forest. Emily clutched Chris's arm, her trembling hands digging into his jacket. Jake shifted beside her, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. Lisa was frozen, her eyes wide as she stared at the looming figure through the leaves. Chris motioned for everyone to stay quiet, pressing a finger to his lips. The man stopped just feet away, tilting his head as if listening for their breaths. His face was obscured by shadow, but his stance was predatory, the chainsaw hanging loosely in his hand. Then, without warning, the figure swung the chainsaw into the bushes. The group scattered in a frenzy, screams piercing the air as the blade narrowly missed them. The bushes exploded into a shower of leaves and broken branches, the chainsaw ripping through the vegetation with terrifying ease. "Run!" Chris shouted, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her up. The group sprinted through the forest, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. Behind them, the man gave chase, the chainsaw revving loudly as he pursued them. Lisa tripped over a root and fell hard to the ground. Mark doubled back to help her, but the man was too fast. He loomed over them, his chainsaw raised high. "No!" Lisa screamed, scrambling backward as Mark threw himself between her and the killer. "Get out of here!" Mark shouted at the others, his voice breaking. Chris hesitated, torn between helping his friends and saving Emily, who was limping beside him. "We can't!" Emily cried. "We have to keep going." The man swung the chainsaw down, the blade slicing through Mark's shoulder with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across the forest floor as Mark let out a guttural scream. "Mark!" Jake yelled, his voice cracking as he stopped and turned back. "Go!" Mark shouted again, his voice weak but defiant. "Just go!" Lisa scrambled to her feet and ran toward the others, tears streaming down her face. Jake grabbed her arm, dragging her forward as the killer turned his attention to them. The sound of the chainsaw drowned out everything else as the group fled, leaving Mark behind. Chris felt a wave of guilt crash over him, but he knew there was no time to mourn. The forest seemed to close in around them, the once beautiful scenery now a maze of twisted trees and suffocating shadows. The killer's footsteps were close behind, accompanied by the relentless roar of the chainsaw. "This way!" Chris yelled, leading the group toward a faint light in the distance. They broke through the trees into another clearing, this one dominated by a rocky outcrop. Chris scanned the area, his mind racing. "We can climb it," he said, pointing to the rocks. "He won't be able to follow us." "Are you insane?" Lisa shouted. "We're not climbers. Do you have a better idea?" Chris snapped. The group scrambled up the rocks, their hands slipping on the cold, damp surface. Chris helped Emily as best he could, practically dragging her up. Jake and Lisa followed, their breaths ragged and frantic. The sound of the chainsaw grew louder as the killer entered the clearing. He stopped at the base of the rocks, tilting his head as he stared up at them. For a moment, the group thought they were safe. But then the man lifted the chainsaw and began cutting into the rock face. Sparks flew as the blade bit into the stone, the sound grating and otherworldly. "He's insane!" Lisa cried, her voice breaking. "We have to keep going," Chris yelled. As they climbed higher, the rocks became steeper and more slippery. The faint light they'd seen earlier now revealed itself to be the moon, its cold glow casting long shadows over the clearing. When they reached the top, they paused to catch their breath, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and fear. The clearing below was empty. The man had vanished. "Where did he go?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Chris scanned the forest, his heart pounding. "I don't know. But we can't stay here. Are we just going to keep running?" Lisa asked, tears streaming down her face. "He's going to kill us all." Chris opened his mouth to respond, but a low, guttural laugh echoed through the forest again. This time, it was closer. "Move," he said, his voice firm. "We have to keep moving." The group pressed on, the oppressive weight of fear driving them forward despite their exhaustion. The climb had left their limbs heavy, but the knowledge that the chainsaw-wielding maniac was somewhere in the forest kept their adrenaline pumping. Chris took the lead, his eyes scanning the uneven ground for any signs of danger. Emily leaned heavily on him, her twisted ankle slowing them down. Lisa and Jake trailed behind, the silence between them thick with dread. The guttural laugh echoed again, this time reverberating through the trees like a ghostly taunt. "He's toying with us," Lisa said, her voice barely audible. "He's playing a game. We're not going to let him win," Chris replied, though his voice betrayed his doubt. The moonlight offered faint guidance, but the forest seemed to shift around them, the familiar paths twisting into a labyrinth. Every shadow looked like it could hide their pursuer, and every distant sound felt like an omen of doom. Then came the faint hum of the chainsaw. It started softly, like a low growl, before building into a deafening roar that seemed to come from every direction. "He's close!" Jake yelled, panic lacing his voice. Chris turned sharply, guiding the group toward a narrow path that wound deeper into the forest. The trees here were denser, their branches interlocking above to form a dark canopy. "Are you sure about this?" Lisa asked, struggling to keep up. "It's better than staying out in the open," Chris shot back. As they pushed through the thick underbrush, the sound of the chainsaw grew louder, cutting through the night like a predator's roar. Emily stumbled, crying out in pain as her ankle gave way beneath her. "I can't," she sobbed. "I can't keep going." Chris knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. "You have to. Just a little further, okay? We'll find somewhere to hide." Lisa and Jake stood nearby, their eyes darting nervously to the trees. The chainsaw roared again, impossibly close now. "There!" Jake shouted, pointing to a hollowed-out tree trunk just off the path. "We can hide in there." "It's too small for all of us," Chris said, glancing at Emily. "Then just take her." Jake snapped. "We'll figure something else out." Chris hesitated, torn between staying with the group and protecting Emily. "Go," Lisa said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Get her to safety. We'll draw him away." Before Chris could argue, Lisa grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him in the opposite direction, their footsteps crunching loudly as they ran into the darkness. "Stay safe," Chris whispered after them, then helped Emily limp toward the hollow tree. The inside of the trunk smelled of damp earth and decay, but it was just large enough for the two of them to squeeze inside. Chris crouched next to Emily, his heart pounding as he listened to the distant roar of the chainsaw. Minutes passed like hours. The forest was eerily silent again, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Chris strained his ears, trying to pick up any sign of Lisa and Jake. Then, out of the silence, came a blood-curdling scream. Lisa! Chris tensed, his breath catching in his throat. He wanted to run, to help her, but Emily grabbed his arm. Don't, she whispered, her voice trembling. You'll get yourself killed. The scream was cut off abruptly, replaced by the revving of the chainsaw. Chris clenched his fists, his mind racing with guilt and helplessness. Then, the footsteps began. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. Chris held his breath, his body frozen as the maniac's shadow passed just outside the hollow. The chainsaw hummed softly now, as if its owner was savoring the moment. The shadow lingered for a moment, then moved on. Chris exhaled shakily, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned to Emily, his voice barely a whisper. We have to find the others, he said. But deep down, he wasn't sure if there was anyone left to find. The forest seemed to breathe around them, every shadow alive with menace. Chris and Emily remained huddled in the hollow tree, the damp, rotting wood pressing against their backs. The distant sound of the chainsaw hummed intermittently, growing louder and then fading, as if the killer were teasing them. Chris leaned out slightly, peering through a gap in the bark. The moonlight cast faint beams across the forest floor, but there was no sign of movement. He glanced at Emily, whose face was pale and streaked with tears. We can't stay here, he whispered. If he comes back, we're trapped. Emily nodded weakly, her ankle swollen and useless. I don't think I can run anymore. Chris took a deep breath, steeling himself. Then we'll find a way to keep you safe. But first, we have to move. He helped her out of the hollow, doing his best to support her weight as they stumbled deeper into the forest. Every step felt like a gamble, each rustling leaf or snapping twig setting his nerves on edge. The trees grew taller and denser, their gnarled branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. Chris's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of Lisa or Jake. The memory of Lisa's scream haunted him, but he refused to give up hope. As they moved, they stumbled upon a small, weathered cabin nestled among the trees. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, but it offered a glimmer of hope. There, Chris said, guiding Emily toward it. The inside of the cabin was no better than its exterior. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the air was thick with the stench of mildew. A rusted wood stove sat in one corner, and a pile of old tools was haphazardly stacked near the door. Chris helped Emily onto a battered sofa, then began barricading the door with whatever he could find. He dragged a rickety table and a few chairs into place, the noise echoing ominously in the silence. Do you think he'll find us here? Emily asked, her voice trembling. Chris paused, his hands gripping the edge of a broken chair. I don't know. But it's better than being out there. Suddenly, a faint noise came from outside, a soft, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps in the snow. Chris froze, his heart pounding. He gestured for Emily to stay quiet, then crept toward the window. He peeked out cautiously, his breath fogging the glass. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a shadow moved at the edge of the clearing. It was him. The maniac stood there, his chainsaw resting against his shoulder. He didn't move, but Chris could feel his eyes on the cabin. The man tilted his head, as if studying the structure, then took a slow step forward. Chris ducked away from the window, his mind racing. He's here, he whispered. Emily's eyes widened in terror. What do we do? Before Chris could answer, the chainsaw roared to life, its deafening growl filling the night. The maniac began walking toward the cabin, the blade cutting through the air as he dragged it behind him. Chris grabbed a rusted wrench from the pile of tools, his hands trembling. Stay behind me, he said, positioning himself between Emily and the door. The maniac reached the porch, his heavy boots creaking on the warped wood. He didn't knock or test the handle, he simply revved the chainsaw and drove it into the door. The barricade shuddered under the impact, splinters flying as the blade tore through the wood. Chris braced himself, gripping the wrench tightly. "Come on," he shouted, his voice a mix of fear and defiance. The door gave way with a final, ear-splitting crack. The maniac stepped into the cabin, his massive frame filling the doorway. His face was hidden beneath a filthy, weathered mask, and his eyes burned with a cruel, predatory light. Emily let out a muffled sob as the maniac raised the chainsaw, the blade gleaming in the moonlight. Chris lunged forward, swinging the wrench with all his strength. It connected with the maniac's arm, causing him to stagger slightly, but the chainsaw remained steady in his grip. The maniac turned his gaze on Chris, his guttural laugh echoing through the cabin. Chris felt a cold wave of terror wash over him as he realized he might not make it out alive. Chris's heart pounded as the maniac stepped fully into the cabin, his massive frame blocking the only exit. The chainsaw roared again, its blade slicing the air menacingly. "Stay back!" Chris shouted, swinging the wrench in wide arcs. His voice wavered, betraying his fear. The maniac tilted his head as if amused, his guttural laugh reverberating through the small space. He lunged forward, the chainsaw's blade tearing through a rickety chair as Chris narrowly dodged. "Emily, go!" Chris yelled, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, her eyes fixed on the horrific figure advancing on them. Chris swung the wrench again, this time connecting with the maniac's side. The blow made him stumble slightly, but it was clear he barely felt it. The maniac's focus shifted entirely to Chris, his movements more deliberate and menacing. Chris realized he couldn't overpower him. The only option was to buy time. "Come on, you bastard!" Chris taunted, backing toward the far end of the room. "You want me? Come and get me!" The maniac followed, his heavy boots crunching on broken glass and debris. Chris led him away from Emily, his mind racing for a plan. His eyes darted to the wood stove in the corner, its rusted edges jagged and sharp. He maneuvered himself closer to the stove, gripping the wrench tightly. As the maniac raised the chainsaw for another strike, Chris ducked and swung the wrench at the chainsaw's handle. The tool's edge hit its mark, jarring the saw and causing it to sputter. The maniac snarled in anger, but the brief distraction gave Chris just enough time to shove him toward the stove. The maniac collided with the metal, his mask scraping against the rusted edge. He roared in pain and fury, the sound animalistic. "Emily, run now!" Chris shouted. Snapping out of her paralysis, Emily tried to stand, wincing in pain as she limped toward the door. But the maniac recovered too quickly. He turned, his chainsaw revving again as he lunged at Chris with renewed ferocity. Chris barely managed to dodge, the blade grazing his jacket and sending sparks flying. He stumbled, falling hard against the wall. Emily reached the door, her hand on the broken frame, but the maniac's attention snapped to her. "No!" Chris shouted, throwing the wrench with all his might. It struck the maniac in the back, making him pause for a moment. Emily limped out onto the porch, but her injured ankle gave out, and she collapsed into the snow. Chris scrambled to his feet, grabbing a jagged piece of wood from the shattered door. He charged at the maniac, driving the splintered wood into his shoulder. The maniac howled, jerking back and slamming Chris against the wall. Chris gasped as the air was knocked out of him, his vision swimming. The killer yanked the wood from his shoulder, blood dripping onto the floor. He turned back to Chris, his mask tilting as though he were savoring the moment. But outside, Emily managed to pull herself up and scream at the top of her lungs. "Help! Somebody help us!" The sound echoed through the forest, breaking the eerie silence. The maniac hesitated, his head snapping toward the door. Chris took advantage of the moment, grabbing another broken chair leg and swinging it wildly. It connected with the maniac's arm, forcing him to drop the chainsaw. "Emily, run!" Chris shouted, diving for the weapon. Emily began to crawl away, her cries for help growing fainter as she moved into the forest. Chris's fingers brushed the chainsaw's handle just as the maniac kicked him in the ribs, sending him sprawling. The maniac picked up the chainsaw again, his rage palpable. Chris struggled to his feet, coughing and clutching his side. He knew he couldn't win this fight. But if Emily could escape, it would all be worth it. The maniac revved the chainsaw, advancing slowly, his dark silhouette towering over Chris. Outside, Emily's cries faded into the distance. Chris closed his eyes for a brief moment, bracing himself for the end. And then, the faint sound of voices echoed through the forest. "Over here," someone shouted. The maniac froze, his head tilting toward the sound. Chris's eyes snapped open, hope flaring in his chest. Help was coming, but would it be in time? The faint voices in the distance sent a wave of hope surging through Chris. He locked eyes with the maniac, whose posture stiffened as he realized they were no longer alone. For the first time, the maniac's confidence seemed to waver. Chris seized the opportunity. Summoning every ounce of strength left in his battered body, he lunged forward, aiming for the chainsaw. His hands closed around the handle just as the maniac tried to yank it away. They struggled, the deafening roar of the chainsaw filling the air as the blade swung dangerously close to both of them. "Let go!" Chris growled, using his weight to push the maniac back. The maniac snarled, his grip ironclad. With a sharp twist, he wrenched the chainsaw free and slammed Chris to the ground. Chris gasped in pain as his head struck the floor. The maniac loomed over him, raising the chainsaw high. But just as he prepared to strike, the voices grew louder. "Over here!" Flashlights cut through the darkness outside, their beams bouncing off the trees. The maniac hesitated, his head snapping toward the light. "Help!" Chris croaked, his voice barely audible. The maniac let out a frustrated growl and stepped back. He turned and darted out of the cabin, his heavy boots thudding against the porch. Chris lay on the floor, gasping for air as the sound of the chainsaw receded into the distance. Moments later, two figures burst into the cabin. They were park rangers, their uniforms dusted with snow and their flashlights casting harsh beams across the room. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, crouching beside Chris. "He's here," Chris wheezed. "The maniac, he went that way." The second ranger scanned the room, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. "Stay with him," he said to his partner. "I'll radio for backup and check outside." The ranger stepped out, leaving Chris with the other. The adrenaline began to wear off, and the pain in Chris's ribs and head became unbearable. "Emily," he rasped. "She's out there. You have to find her." "We will," the ranger assured him. "Just try to stay calm." Chris closed his eyes, his mind racing with fear for Emily. He pictured her crawling through the snow, injured and vulnerable, while the maniac stalked the forest. Minutes felt like hours. The other ranger returned, shaking his head. "No sign of him," he said. "But we'll keep searching. We've got more units on the way." "Did you find the girl?" Chris asked weakly. The rangers exchanged a glance, their expressions grim. "Not yet," one of them admitted. Chris forced himself to sit up, ignoring the stabbing pain in his ribs. "We have to find her before he does." Before the rangers could respond, a blood-curdling scream tore through the night. Chris's heart sank. It was Emily. The rangers sprang into action, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they ran toward the sound. Chris staggered to his feet, determined to follow despite his injuries. Outside, the forest was alive with movement. The rangers' voices called out, overlapping with Emily's fading cries. Chris pushed himself forward, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The snow around him was stained red. Ahead, the ranger's flashlights illuminated a clearing. Chris stumbled into it, his breath catching in his throat at the sight before him. Emily lay in the snow, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. Blood pooled beneath her, and her lips moved as if she were trying to speak. Chris dropped to his knees beside her. "Emily, it's okay," he said, choking back tears. "We're here. You're safe now." But Emily's eyes shifted, looking past Chris. Her lips trembled as she forced out a single word. "Behind." Chris turned just in time to see the maniac step out of the shadows, the chainsaw roaring to life once more. The maniac's towering silhouette emerged from the shadows, the chainsaw's roar splitting the frigid night. Its blade gleamed menacingly as he stepped closer, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. Chris froze, his heart pounding as he positioned himself protectively in front of Emily. The rangers, momentarily stunned, raised their weapons, their flashlights bouncing off the mask covering the maniac's face. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted, his gun trained on the killer. The maniac stopped, tilting his head as though considering the command. Then, with a guttural laugh, he raised the chainsaw higher and took another step forward. The ranger fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the forest. The maniac staggered, the impact hitting his shoulder. Blood spattered onto the snow, but he barely flinched. Instead, he let out a deep, enraged growl and charged at the rangers. "Move," the second ranger yelled, firing off another shot. This time, the bullet struck the chainsaw, sending sparks flying, but it did nothing to slow the maniac. Chris grabbed a fallen branch from the ground, his grip tight despite the trembling in his hands. He knew the rangers wouldn't be able to stop him alone. As the maniac closed the distance, one of the rangers was forced to dive out of the way. The other swung the butt of his rifle, striking the maniac across the mask. The impact knocked the killer back a step, but it only seemed to enrage him further. Chris seized his moment. With a guttural yell, he charged forward, swinging the branch with all his strength. It connected with the maniac's arm, knocking the chainsaw out of his grasp. The weapon fell to the snow, its motor sputtering to a stop. The maniac turned his full attention to Chris, his eyes burning with fury behind the mask. "Come on!" Chris shouted, adrenaline drowning out his fear. The maniac lunged, his massive hand closing around Chris's throat. Chris gasped for air as the killer lifted him off the ground, his grip like iron. The rangers sprang into action. One tackled the maniac from behind, forcing him to drop Chris, while the other fired another shot, this time hitting the killer in the leg. The maniac roared in pain, his movements slowing. Chris collapsed to the ground, coughing and clutching his throat. He scrambled toward Emily, who was barely conscious, her breathing shallow. "It's okay," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "We're going to get out of this." The maniac, wounded but far from defeated, shoved the ranger off his back and staggered toward Chris and Emily. His steps were uneven, but his determination was unrelenting. The second ranger grabbed the chainsaw from the ground, struggling to lift its weight. He started the motor with a loud roar, positioning himself between the maniac and the others. "Stay back," the ranger warned, the blade spinning wildly. For the first time, the maniac hesitated. His head tilted slightly as he regarded the ranger and the weapon. Then, with a guttural snarl, he charged one last time. The ranger swung the chainsaw with all his strength, the blade connecting with the maniac's chest. Blood sprayed across the snow as the killer let out a horrific scream, his body jerking violently. The ranger didn't stop, driving the blade deeper until the maniac collapsed to his knees. Finally, the forest fell silent. The ranger stepped back, panting, as the maniac's lifeless body slumped forward into the snow. Chris held Emily tightly, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to process what had just happened. The nightmare seemed to be over, but the terror lingered in the air. One of the rangers crouched beside them. "It's over," he said gently. "You're safe now." Chris nodded weakly, his gaze drifting to the blood-soaked snow. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The maniac's body lay motionless in the snow, his mask cracked, revealing only a pale, scarred cheek. The chainsaw sputtered and died, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Chris clung to Emily, his breathing uneven. The rangers stood over the body, weapons still drawn, their expressions a mix of relief and wariness. "Is he dead?" one ranger asked. The other knelt and pressed 2 fingers to the killer's neck. After a moment, he nodded. "He's gone." Chris closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe it was truly over. But then Emily stirred weakly in his arms, her voice barely above a whisper. "Chris," she rasped. "He's not alone." The words sent a chill down Chris's spine. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. Emily's eyes fluttered open, glassy and filled with fear. "There's more. I saw them, watching." The rangers exchanged uneasy glances. "She's in shock," one of them said. "We need to get her to a hospital." But Chris couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's words were more than delirium. He glanced toward the tree line, his gut twisting. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, as if something, or someone, was moving just out of sight. "Let's move," the lead ranger said. He reached for his radio. "We need a medevac at Clearing Bravo, 2 injured civilians, 1 suspect deceased." The other ranger helped Chris to his feet while the lead carefully lifted Emily. The group began to make their way out of the clearing, the crunch of snow underfoot the only sound. Chris looked back at the body one last time. The maniac's mask had slipped off completely, revealing a grotesque, contorted face. But it wasn't just his appearance that unnerved Chris, it was the expression frozen on his lifeless face. A grin. They trekked through the forest in silence, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Chris's mind raced, replaying Emily's words over and over. Watching. Just as they reached the edge of the trail, Chris stopped. His blood ran cold. Footprints. Large, heavy footprints in the snow. They weren't from the rangers or the maniac, they came from deeper in the forest and stopped right at the clearing where the group had been. "Wait," Chris said, his voice shaking. The rangers turned, their faces tense. "What is it?" one of them asked. Chris pointed to the footprints. "Those weren't there before." The rangers followed his gaze, their expressions darkening. The lead ranger stepped closer, examining the tracks. "They're fresh," he muttered. The sound of snapping branches echoed through the trees. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the source. "Stay together," the lead ranger ordered, raising his flashlight. A low growl rumbled from the darkness, followed by the faint crunch of snow. The group tightened their formation, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Chris's heart raced as the sound grew closer. Shadows moved between the trees, too fast and too large to be animals. And then, from the darkness, figures emerged. 3 of them. Each wore the same kind of mask as the maniac, their hands clutching crude, blood-stained weapons, axes, machetes, and knives. "Oh my God," one ranger whispered, his grip tightening on his rifle. The lead ranger stepped forward. "Drop your weapons," he barked. The figures didn't respond. Instead, they spread out, encircling the group. Chris felt a rising panic. They were trapped. Emily stirred in the ranger's arms, her voice barely audible. "I told you, they're never alone." The killers closed in, their masks glinting in the pale moonlight. The killers moved in silence, their steps deliberate as they tightened the noose around the group. The moonlight reflected off their masks, turning their grotesque faces into ghostly apparitions. "Get behind me," the lead ranger ordered, raising his rifle. The other ranger followed suit, aiming at the nearest figure. Chris stood frozen, his arm protectively around Emily, who whimpered faintly. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. "Last warning," the lead ranger barked. The killers didn't stop. Instead, the one holding a machete raised it high, letting out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the forest. The ranger fired. The crack of the rifle shattered the night, and the bullet struck the machete-wielding killer in the chest. He staggered, but instead of falling, he let out a guttural growl and charged. "Impossible," the ranger muttered, firing again. The second shot hit the killer in the head, finally dropping him to the ground. But the other two killers didn't falter. They broke into a sprint, their weapons glinting in the pale light. "Run," the lead ranger shouted, firing at the advancing figures. Chris didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Emily, hoisting her up despite the burning pain in his ribs, and ran as fast as his legs could carry him. The other ranger stayed close, his flashlight bouncing wildly as they crashed through the undergrowth. Behind them, the sound of gunfire and screams filled the air. Chris dared to glance back and saw the lead ranger grappling with one of the killers. The chainsaw-wielding maniac's bloodied mask lay discarded nearby, a haunting reminder of the horror they were leaving behind. "Keep going," the remaining ranger urged, pushing Chris forward. The forest seemed to close in around them, the towering trees turning into shadowy sentinels. Chris's lungs burned, and his legs felt like they were about to give out, but the thought of Emily kept him moving. Finally, the trees thinned, and the faint glow of the ranger station came into view. Relief washed over Chris, but it was short-lived. A piercing howl erupted from the forest, followed by the heavy crunch of snow. "They're coming," the ranger shouted, pulling his pistol. Chris stumbled into the clearing, nearly collapsing as he reached the station. He kicked open the door and dragged Emily inside, slamming it shut behind him. The ranger followed, locking the door and shoving a heavy desk in front of it. "They won't stop," the ranger said, his voice trembling. "They're not human." Chris placed Emily on a nearby couch, his chest heaving. "What are they?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The ranger shook his head. "Legends. Stories about the forest. I didn't believe them until now." The door rattled, the sound of heavy fists pounding against the wood. Chris grabbed a fire axe from the wall, gripping it tightly. "We have to fight." The ranger nodded, raising his gun. "Whatever happens, don't let them take you." The door splintered, and the killers burst inside. Chaos erupted as the ranger fired, hitting one square in the chest. Chris swung the axe, the blade connecting with another's arm. Blood sprayed, but the killers didn't slow. Their inhuman strength and relentless pursuit were like a force of nature, unstoppable and merciless. One grabbed the ranger, slamming him into the wall. His gun fell to the ground, and before Chris could react, the killer plunged a knife into his chest. "No!" Chris screamed, swinging the axe again. The blade buried itself in the killer's side, and he let out an unearthly howl. Chris pulled Emily close, his back against the wall as the remaining killer advanced. Just as the machete came down, headlights flooded the cabin. The sound of tires crunching over snow drowned out the chaos, and a loudspeaker blared. "Drop your weapons. This is the police." The killers hesitated, their masks tilting toward the light. Then, as if on cue, they turned and bolted into the forest, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. Chris collapsed to the floor, clutching Emily as officers stormed in, weapons drawn. "It's over," one of them said, kneeling beside Chris. But as Chris looked out the shattered window, his heart sank. In the distance, beyond the tree line, a figure stood watching. The original maniac's bloodied mask was back on his face, and his chainsaw roared to life. The forest was far from finished with them.